My name is Ileana Soto-Welty. I'm with MindOC. I also with me today presenting is Dr. Miguel Gallardo from Pepperdine University. We also have some team members from MindOC, Andrea Mander, as well as Dr. Lincoln. And we have two special presentations today from our partners, Diana Daly from First Five, and also representatives from HEC Trauma Institute. So we have a full schedule today. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the ACEs Aware initiative, which was started by the California Surgeon General and DHCS, which set a very bold goal to reduce ACEs and toxic stress by half in one generation. This initiative was aimed at screening children and adults for ACEs and connecting patients to interventions, resources, and other supports to improve the health and well-being of individuals and families. As you can see on the slide, these are the top most commonly reported ACEs, which include emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, living in a home where there was an absent biological parent, domestic violence, someone who is mentally ill or suicidal, someone addicted to drugs or alcohol, or someone who was incarcerated. In addition to these ACEs, we also recognize other factors that impact trauma and toxic stress, such as racism. We also know that the social determinants of health determine 80% of our health outcomes, which can include where we live, work, and play. These determinants of health include access to education, economic stability, built environment, and social and community context, for example. So we have taken a broader perspective of this initial framework, and we're hoping to make connections to address the root causes behind trauma and toxic stress. What we do know is that the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for the leading causes of death, such as heart disease, cancer, diabetes, stroke, kidney disease, and suicide attempts. And the higher prevalence of ACEs were found in women, people who are low income, people of color, justice involved, and part of the LGBTQ community. So preventing ACEs and toxic stress can reduce negative health conditions. And imagine if we could prevent millions of cases of heart disease, obesity, depression, if we were able to prevent these ACEs. Be Well received an implementation grant and brought together over 25 partners to build a trauma-informed network of care. This is a cross-sector collaboration aimed at connecting people to resources, and our aim was to do it through a closed-loop referral system. We developed an infrastructure where we had an executive committee, a steering committee, and 3 work groups, which included our coordinating platform, our equity and inclusion committee, and our community and clinical group. Together, we developed this vision statement through a co-design process, and I'd love to read it for you. Orange County's Trauma-Informed Network of Care envisions a system that supports all residents in achieving their full potential to thrive by enacting radical cultural shifts to promote community healing of trauma and by centering equity and inclusion to create systemic community change. Together, we will ensure individuals, families, and communities are connected to resources that find and walk with them. These are the definitions that we developed together as a network. And I love to read all of them, but I think my favorite is the healing one, which is what we're focused on today. Healing involves a continuum of treatment that leads to the empowerment of community to be ambassadors, integrating the experience and transcending it. It seeks to understand individual needs and healing, addresses mind, body, and spirit, as well as the cultural, racial, ethnic aspects of an individual. Healing occurs at all levels, including individual, organizational, community, and systems. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. This has been our journey. We started in April of 2021. We did a lot of visioning together, co-creating of the processes, connecting our partners, and we did select a coordinating infrastructure. We did some cultural responsiveness focus groups. and did a lot of deeper work around addressing some pilot projects to get people started on that. So we're at the stage where we are expanding, working on sustainability, and we are happy to welcome all of you today as we continue on this journey. So a little bit about equity, and from the beginning, this initiative centered equity. Equity is fairness and justice achieved through systematically assessing disparities and opportunities, outcomes, and representation, and redressing those disparities through targeted actions. This framework here is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which really gives a broader perspective of the kind of change that we want to make overall through cross-sector collaboration and promoting well-being, integrating health services and systems, creating more equitable communities. Be Well is a collective impact organization, and the collective impact model through the collective impact forum, it has been updated. So we now have the collective impact 2.0, which has centered equity. And these are some of the things that we have been striving to do, which involves engaging, going beyond just working together as a backbone organization with our partners, but really focusing on aiming to do systems change, addressing inequalities, addressing issues of social justice, creating shared language, shifting, involving community more, and developing more leadership around these areas. So our goal is to continue on this journey using this model. And then we're here to talk about healing. I'm just going to give a brief overview of why healing, and then we're going to get started on Dr. Gallardo's presentation, which will take a deeper dive. But we started as a trauma-informed network of care, but I think that as we have progressed, we wanted to really focus on healing. Not only healing ourselves, healing individuals and families, but healing our organizations, our community, and systems. Rarely, if ever, any of us are healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. And so we're taking this approach for several reasons. Going beyond the individual level to address root causes, like I said, to heal our organizations, communities, and systems. Because by only treating the individual, we only address part of the equation, leaving the toxic systems, policies, and practices neatly intact. And well-being comes from participating and transforming the root causes of that harm. To go beyond treatment and medical models that are focused on alleviating symptoms rather than strengthening the roots of well-being. So our approach in being more healing-centered is more about policy and systems change, and rather than just clinical, which I think we've done a good job of setting that up. Our partners have done so many ACEs screenings, but it's also in creating the conditions for communities to continue to thrive. So it's in our voice in transforming those systems and coming together and connecting that I think will truly create change. And by healing, we interrupt the cycle of trauma and begin to address intergenerational trauma. When we heal, we stop the cycle of violence and toxicity in our human interactions, especially as parents. Sometimes we pass some of that on to our children. So through collective healing, we will address trauma holistically through a cultural, spiritual, and civic lens. And we become agents in the creation and restoring of our own well-being and begin to address issues of social justice, liberation, oppression, and to advocate for policies to improve our environments where we live, work, and play. So really, collective healing is about collective action. These are the proven ways that the ACEs Aware Initiative has said we can reduce toxic stress and the stress response. This includes access to mental health care, having supportive relationships, quality sleep, balanced nutrition, physical activity, mindfulness practices, and access to nature. So taking sort of the mind, body, and spirit approach to all of this. And we are focusing a lot of our resources on creating connections to these stress busters. And to practice that, let's see, I wanted to introduce Diana Daly from First Five, and just to tell you a little bit about Diana. She's been on our executive committee, and we're just really lucky to have her be part of our network. She has spent over 40 years in healthcare services, planning, and policy. And for the last 20 years, Diana has had an active yoga practice. In 2017, she became a certified yoga teacher and has taken additional trainings in accessible yoga, trauma-informed yoga practices, and mindfulness-based stress reduction practices. Before the pandemic, she taught classes in a variety of settings, including to veterans in recovery, veterans who have been formerly unhoused, and families residing in permanent supportive housing. She loves sharing the practice with others and looks forward to sharing with you right now. So we're excited to have you join us, Diana.
Thank you so much, and lovely to see many of your faces here and see your names. So welcome all. I'm appreciative of being invited to share a breathing practice with you all. And first, you hear so much about breathing, so I just wanted to go through real quick a few facts because I think that may be helpful. So when we do some conscious breathing and we work on really paying attention to our breath and controlling our breath, it helps us generate more oxygen in our body, right? So oxygen is part of our life force. So it just helps our body feel stronger and healthier. And then it also can connect your mind and body. So if you think about it, you know, how many functions in your body are both involuntary and voluntary? Okay, most of them are either one or the other. And actually they say there's only two that are both involuntary and voluntary. And that one is breathing, right? We take our first breath when we come into this world, and we take our last breath when we leave this world, and we're breathing all the time in between. But we can also control it. We can consciously control it. Did anybody have a guess on what the other one is, the function that we can have both involuntary and voluntary? I think I can't tell on the screen here, but it's this. Blinking. So the other one is blinking. So we can control that. So again, just practicing that helps us bring our mind and body together. And when we can control our breathing, it also helps us control our blood pressure, our heartbeat. You know, we can affect those and lower those when we are consciously breathing. And that is because consciously breathing helps us turn on our parasympathetic nervous system, right? So that's our relaxation nervous response versus our sympathetic nervous system, which is that flight, fight, freeze, right? Which is what we're in, what trauma causes, right? It's that stress trauma. So we're trying to counteract that and let our body spend more time in a parasympathetic mode and not a sympathetic stress-induced mode. So it really helps there. And then the last thing and how it really ties into mindfulness practice is it gives us something to focus on, right? So being my definition of being mindful is being here in the present, not ruminating on something that happened yesterday or an hour ago or 8 years ago, or not getting anxious about something that's going to happen later today, or again, may never happen, right? But you are afraid it might. So being in the present, just focusing now as we go through this, if you listen and you practice, we all practice together, you really aren't going to be able to think of anything else, or you'll forget what to do, right? But if that happens, it's easy because this is all a practice. If that happens, then just come back, say, oh, I was just thinking about what I'm going to make for dinner tonight, and just let it go, right? Don't judge it, just let it go. So we're going to do a breathing practice today. There's many different practices, but I thought this would be a good one for this morning. And often it's called three-part breathing. So that's what we're going to end up doing. We're going to get to something called three-part breathing. But in order to start, just find a comfortable way to sit where you're at now, maybe push back from your desk a bit. And see if you can, again, if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, then do whatever does work for you. But if you are able to get both of your feet on the ground, firmly planted on the ground, so you can feel the earth kind of resisting you, right? And you're pushing down on the earth and it's pushing back up on you. So your feet are on the ground equally. And you just start with resting your hands on your laps, palms up, palms down, whatever you're feeling like this morning. And then if it's comfortable for you to close your eyes, go ahead and do that. If it's not, just find something to focus on a little bit ahead of yourselves, but so that your eyes can be soft. And we just want to start with just, again, consciously thinking about how you are breathing at this moment. Just pay attention to it. Right now, we're not doing anything special. Just find your own breath and just notice how your breath is right now. Usually just by noticing it, it's going to start slowing down and getting a little more calm. But it may not be that way right now. You may be breathing a little heavy. You may be breathing short. Just pay attention again, no judgment, but what's happening in your body at this moment with your breathing. Just take a few breaths. Notice how the air, and usually in a breathing practice, you want to breathe in and out of your nose, at least for this breathing practice. We're going to breathe in and out of our nose. If that doesn't work for you again, breathe in or out through your mouth or one or the other. But if you can work towards breathing in and out of your nose, the instructions will work better. So just notice how the air is coming in through your nose, cooler air maybe, moving down your throat, into your lungs and abdomen. And then as you exhale, maybe notice how if your shoulders move a bit, your ribs. Just take a moment. So now, if it works for you, it may be helpful to notice more about your body. If you just move your right hand down to your lower belly, right below your belly button, and then just gently rest your left hand up by your heart. Just to let it relax, your elbows relax, but just have it kind of near your heart, maybe a little above. When we think about three-part breathing, we're going to think about our body and our abdomen as a glass. Think about it as a glass, and think about when you fill a glass with water, what fills up first? The bottom of the glass fills up. So as you start breathing, notice the air filling up the bottom of your abdomen first, and then it moves up to the middle, your rib area, and then it moves up even higher up to by your heart area. And then when you empty a glass of water, it drains, right? If you're draining a pool, it drains, the top goes down, then the middle, and finally the bottom. So as you exhale, notice the air going out of the top of your lung, your ribs, and down into your lower belly. In fact, when you get to your lower belly, you may pull your belly button in just slightly towards your spine. So maybe a little active use of your abdomen there to exhale all the air out of your belly. When you do that, as you breathe in, then you're going to relax your abdomen up into your ribs, up into the top part of your lungs. And just do that a few times. Just notice filling up from the bottom and exhaling from the top, emptying out your breath. We'll do that a few more times. So now for three-part breathing, all we're going to do is add some pauses. So let's all exhale and just wait for everybody to get to their exhale. Just pause for a moment with your exhale. And now you're going to start inhaling, but only a third of the way. Just fill up that lower part and stop and pause. And then fill up that middle part, another inhale, adding to that inhale, and stop and pause. And finally, the fullest part of that inhale, you're filling up the top, stop and pause. And then slowly as you can, a nice exhale out. We're going to do that a few more times. We're going to inhale in a three-part breath. So inhale the bottom part of your abdomen and pause. The middle part, your ribs may be expanding. Pause, and then the top up to the fullest apexes of your lungs. And then a slow exhale out. Let's do that one more time with the inhale. Inhale the bottom part, middle part, top part, and a nice exhale out. And now just take a few moments and just take a couple breaths, full breaths in and out. Kind of reset ourselves. And just maybe notice your breath's different from when it was when we first started. Now we're going to practice doing that 3-part on the exhale. So let's everybody take in your inhale and pause. We'll wait for everybody to get their inhale in. And now start a 3-part exhale. So exhale and just notice the upper part of your lungs releasing the air and pause. The middle part of your rib cage releasing, pausing, and then that lower abdomen and pulling in that belly button maybe slightly. Pausing and then taking a nice big inhale in. We're going to do that 2 more times. Exhale, first third. Exhale, second third. Exhale, the last third. And then another breath in. One more time, exhale. Maybe you're seeing how much air you let out each time. So if you don't have a whole bunch or none left at the end, right? So that's part of the practice, is learning how to equally divide those breaths into thirds. And you're done that, just take in a few more breaths. And now you probably guessed it, we're going to put it all together. So let's just take a couple more breaths. Notice your breathing. This is work, so you may need to kind of get your breath calm again. And then we're just going to do 2 rounds of a 3-part breath that's all inhale and exhale. So let's all exhale together. And then start with the 3-part inhale, the lower part of your abdomen, and pause. The middle part, the upper part, and pause. And now you're going to control it going out. Upper part down a third, middle part down a third, lower abdomen, pull that belly in. And then we're going to do it one more time. Inhale, bottom, middle, top, pause. And then exhale, top, middle, bottom, pause. And now just take in your own breath and just kind of be thinking about that. Don't do a pause, but go back to just thinking about filling up from the bottom and letting go from the top. And as you do that, just notice a few last breaths. As you breathe in, think about what you want to bring into your life, bring into your body, bring into your world. What do you want to breathe in? Do you want to breathe in joy, kindness, compassion, love? What comes to you of what you want to breathe in? And then as you breathe out, think about what you want to let go of. You want to let go of anxiety, fear, sadness, whatever comes to you. And just a few times, and you can change that word. You know, sometimes we call it a mantra. You can change that. You can use the same one if it's really speaking to you right now. Just take that big, fullest breath in. Inhale what you want to bring in. And then exhale what you want to get rid of. A few more breaths. And then if you haven't brought your hands back down to your lap, bring them back down to your lap. And if you have your eyes closed, you just want to slowly adjust to reopening your eyes, just maybe blinking a little bit or opening when you're looking down, and then start looking back up to the screen and come back. I'm just going to leave you with a little quote, and it says, "Changing the patterns of our breath changes the patterns of our mind and our life." So just a little intro into breathing practice. I have found that the more I do it, the more I get out of it. Every time you learn something new, there's many, many different breathing practices. So something to look into as part of your mindful practice for your stress buster. Okay, thanks, Ileana, for the time. And I hope that was soothing and mindful for folks.
That was beautiful, Diana. Thank you. Much needed. So we're really lucky to have Diana and some other partners that we will be highlighting on this webinar series. And now I'm going to pass it over to Miguel, who is a self-proclaimed multicultural community psychologist. And Miguel, you can tell us what that means. But thank you. He's going to take a deeper dive into healing and what that means for this work. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ileana. I don't know if I'm self-proclaimed or it just sort of developed out of the work that I've been doing for a couple of decades at this point. Really, it just means that I'm interested in cross-cultural relationships and thinking about things from community and systemic perspectives, and trying to address those issues, from those different vantage points. So I appreciate the invitation. I was thinking as Diana was doing the breathing exercise, I think I should have her just intro me every time to sort of calm people down and soothe them before I sort of get their fight or flights up and running, potentially with some of the content that I might present. So it was a nice introduction. I'm somewhat joking and also somewhat serious around just some of the things that I'm gonna touch base on over the next maybe half hour or so, as we think about healing and sort of how we maybe have found ourselves here. I was asked to talk a little bit about some terms and some processes that I think have really become very, politicized in many ways, weaponized in other ways, and really I think they've really become avenues in some ways to try to really just prevent us from talking about some of the things that I think are so important, which is the isms of the world, whether it's racism, sexism, classism, whatever it may be, ableism, you name it, heterosexism. I think we are in a particularly interesting place in our history, around how we can continue to move forward in trying to address some of these issues and not necessarily continue to perpetuate further divide and divisiveness. And so I have here a few considerations, just thinking about just self-care, and I think thought Diana's mindfulness breathing exercise was really apt and really appropriate, and I think also something that we can all use when being triggered. Shutting off our screens, maybe taking a deep breath, walking away, coming back. I will tell you that my intent is not to in any way whatsoever trigger people and to try to provoke any particular kind of reaction or emotion as I talk over the next half hour. But I just know that I may say some things that might, kind of poke and prod folks in different ways a little bit, make people feel a little uncomfortable. And so I say that to say, if something comes up for you as you're listening today and you feel a little bit kind of poked and prodded a little bit, do some self-care, take a minute, do some breathing, and then come back when you're ready, potentially. Notice any themes or trends in yourself too, as you listen to some of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit about. I think it's important that we, you'll hear me come back to this, in different ways throughout my brief time around just our own sort of self-awareness and understanding of where we're located in these conversations, in these discussions. I heard Ileana, mention the word political. And when I think about political, I think a lot of times people think about, literally politics, conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats, whatever dichotomy we want to, really try to put out there to help us sort of feel better and categorize and make sense of the world in some ways. But I think in many ways, it reminds me of Aristotle, actually, who said that, and I'll sort of quote him as best I can, but I'll change it to human, because he said I would say human is by nature a political animal. And he was not referring to the party that you're sort of leaning towards, or that you vote for, or that you tend to endorse and support, from those more traditional perspectives, but really thinking about, that it is impossible for us to remove ourselves from the context in which we find ourselves. And so we are embedded in context, in society, and being embedded in our society and societies, the multitude of those, the context in which we negotiate life, it exposes us to, I think, a lot of maybe messages and ideas that can sometimes be helpful in helping us maybe unlearn some things, and also maybe perpetuate and further reinforce some things that may not be so helpful for us to hold on to and to continue to think about. And so I think, today I'm going to try to engage in a process of kind of learning about some things that I think are important, and then also kind of also simultaneously thinking about how we can unlearn some things as well to help us in our road and our journey towards healing. I I think, just so you know my perspective, I grew up in a very faith-based Catholic Mexican American family. And those values continue to penetrate every ounce of my body and everything that I stand for and everything that I try to do and create in the work that I do. And so, like all entities, the Catholic Church is flawed and has challenges. And yet at the same time, it represents much more than an entity, than an institution for many of us. And so I've benefited greatly from Catholic social teachings around humanity, around expressing compassion, love, kindness, forgiveness, humility. All those are embedded in just sort of my family history. And so I grew up really side by side. Prayer and protest always existed and coexisted, and that is still relevant today. And so as I talk with you about some things that I think are going to be important for us to think about as we move forward in trying to achieve inclusiveness, belonging, equity in our work and in our lives, it's coming from those places. It's coming from that foundation, if you will. And so I think for me, that's important for you to know as I begin to talk a little bit about some of the things that I think are important for us to think about. Okay, Liana. So, I think just as I continue to launch in, the pandemic, along with a lot of, I think, the pandemic in really many ways just really highlighted for many folks things that many of us knew were already there in so many different ways. There are disparities that we see across so many different domains in our society today. There are disparities that I'll address in just a few minutes that are as relevant and as significant, and the gap is as wide today as it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so I think the pandemic really, pandemics historically have really informed us that that these kinds of situations really exacerbate inequalities in so many different ways. And I think we saw that happen within racial and class inequalities, to name a few, and that were pretty salient over the course of the pandemic. And of course, that led to some really difficult, challenging situations of dehumanizing our fellow brothers and sisters who are part of our family, human family, if you will, in many ways. And so I think one of the my glass is always half full, and my lens is always dominated by optimism, hope, and faith. And so I have taken away over these last several years, 4 to 6 years or so, that there are so many people today that are interested, invested, and willing to try to do something to make the world a little bit better than there were prior to this. And so I think we have a lot to hold on to and a lot to sort of take with us as we move forward, and a lot more people to hold hands with and to walk side by side with as we move forward, in trying to figure out how to not repeat the same things we've continued to do over and over again at this moment in time in the future. There was also this collective grief and loss that I think so many of us experienced. It could have been grief from just losing the sort of quote unquote normality of everyday life. the grief of losing loved ones, the grief of losing jobs and relationships in different ways for different reasons. So there was a collective grief and loss process that I think really impacted us in a way that I think none of us had ever experienced before on this kind of a level. And that's, I think in some ways there was a, you know, our greatest strengths can also be our greatest weaknesses. And so I think in many ways it sort of bound us in some ways with a shared experience. And in other ways, it highlighted the differences and the disparities between those who have and those who do not have in essence, in many ways. And so so I think there was a lot to be taken from this experience that we can use to continue to move forward. And then languishing, I read a New York Times article maybe a few years ago that they really highlighted that, you know, people were not, you know, paralyzed, that they couldn't, you know, most people were not sort of debilitated and paralyzed that they couldn't function and do what they had to do. And yet they weren't also just booming with energy and excitement and enthusiasm and thriving. Just kind of many of us at some point in time were just doing what we had to do to get from one day to the next. I think that was relevant for many of us who are parents, who are working parents, who are negotiating school and work and all kinds of other things. And then also for those of us who are parents of color, you know, negotiating the isms as they manifest themselves right before our and our children's eyes, and trying to understand and help them understand how to make sense of all that in many ways. So this idea of languishing, I think, is still in some ways relevant. And I think people have underestimated what it's going to mean for us to sort of get out of this pandemic and sort of reintegrate and restart and re-envision what this is going to look like in some way. There's a transitionary period that I think we're going through at this moment in time. So we experienced a collective trauma in some ways. And then, you know, Ileana mentioned ACEs earlier, and I have a few examples here over the next couple of slides, just to really, I think, highlight those social determinants of health that I think are so important for us to understand when it comes to trauma, and how embedded that is, and how embedded that is over generations for some folks. And so, you know, residential segregation today is as high, you know, and as it was in the 60s in many ways, which also leads to educational segregation in so many ways. And people may not believe that, but when you look at data and statistics, by the way, I'm not sharing, you know, when I share these statistics and data, it's not my personal feelings or, you know, it's factual data. I mean, obviously, if facts could save lives and change people's emotions, we might be in a very different place. It doesn't always happen that way, but there's facts here around these issues that I think are so incredible, that that are so relevant in everyday life. You know, so there's residential segregation, which leads to, you know, economic inequality and food insecurities for many of our families. In fact, actually, when you look at that list of stress busters, all, I think, you know, potentially really good stress busters for those of us who have some privileges. Because sometimes, you know, if I tell a community that I'm working with, just go on a walk, it's like, well, it might not be safe to go on a walk in the neighborhood. Or, you know, just, you know, try to eat a little bit better, eat a little bit more healthy, try to access, you know, and there's cost issues with accessing sometimes those healthier options. There's also the access issue, just physical access issue of where some of our communities in our backyards a mile away or whatever it is, have access to and are aware of it oftentimes. Or, you know, connecting with nature. We know from literature and research that nature is healing, and yet, you know, there are communities who live 10, 15 minutes from some of the most beautiful beaches in the entire country and never make it there and don't go there for a variety of reasons. Now, oftentimes what happens is we want to put the onus on those individuals for not making better or different choices. And I think we have to be careful. You know, certainly we want to help people become self-determined and really sort of lead and sort of change what life looks like for them. And we also have to recognize that there are a variety of circumstances, situations, systems in place that oftentimes make some of those decisions very difficult for our families and communities. And so when we put the onus on the individual for not sort of going that 15, 20 minutes to the beach or wherever it is, we're in essence perpetuating and supporting at times, sometimes the exact systems that in other circumstances, in other ways, we may not be okay with. And so I think it really behooves us to be really intentional and mindful about how we sort of process and think about and understand community circumstances across a variety of different situations and life contexts and cultural backgrounds in many ways. You can go to the next slide, Ileana. So the stress busters list needs to be culturally adapted, if you will, a little bit, culturally tailored, if you will, to a certain degree at different times for different reasons. So again, these are just some other disparities. I don't need to really go into much detail about those. Just want to highlight those for you. Obviously the pandemic raised a lot of health inequities, policing and incarceration. We have a pipeline to prison in place for many Black and brown communities, but we don't have a pipeline to wealth in place for many of those communities. And so why is that? Why is that? Why do we have this pipeline to prison so embedded in the very fabric of our society, but not a pipeline to wealth for many of those communities? And I think we have to really, re-envision and rethink about that, and also just think about how we might be complicit in sustaining some of those systems in place that benefit us and make our lives better, but may unknowingly at times, unconsciously be hurting and continuing to dehumanize and oppress others. And so I think, like all of us, even though I've spent many years talking about these issues, I am equally as much an oppressor as on the oppressed side. And so I have to work hard at trying to make sure that I'm not unintentionally, unconsciously oppressing others. And I do at times, and I stumble and fall, and I have to recognize and realize and pick myself back up, which is traumatizing, both for me when I do it, but also for those who may be on the receiving end of it at times, unknowingly, unconsciously. Okay, Leanna. So in general, I think, when we talk about trauma, this is changing. It's continued to change, but historically, and I would say we're still struggling with this a little bit, because I still hear a lot of trauma folks who aren't necessarily embedded and really connected to the cultural experiences and information, not sort of syncing these two up as much as I think I would like to see that happen at times. I think it's changing though, but historically, I think our traditional trauma theory really imposed a one-size-fits-all perspective. And you had, trauma, quote unquote, traditional trauma experts really talking about these issues. And then you had these cultural sort of quote unquote experts talking about the experiences of trauma, which looked a little bit differently. There was some overlap and some differences, but they weren't talking to each other as much. And so you have these two different sort of perspectives and ideas about what is trauma, what it can look like, how it affects people, where it comes from, etc., how we understand it. And there hadn't been a whole lot of sort of cross hibernation there around these perspectives and views. And I think we're still moving and sort of inching and doing a little bit better of that. But I think we have a little bit more work to do in those areas. And so trauma should really be viewed as inclusive of the different social identities that people experience, whether that's gender, whether that's race, class issues. If we look at all those issues and we sort of compile those into one individual, the heightened and the amount of potential trauma and trauma experiences people are going to endure becomes very challenging, and I think it takes a toll on their physical and emotional well-being and health. And so if we're really going to understand trauma, we need to be, it needs to be a much more inclusive lens, I think, in perspectives. And so our primary means, in many ways for determining whether an experience is a trauma or not, has really in many ways relied on subjective interpretation of events rather than objective reality in many ways. And so Burstow states that trauma is this reaction to a kind of wound. It's a reaction to profoundly injurious events and situations in the real world, and indeed to a world in which people are routinely wounded. And really, they're talking about really a lot of Black, Indigenous people of color, oftentimes, and others as well. Okay, Ileana. So I think when we think about trying to reconceptualize trauma, and this, I'm talking about this because I think it's important to think about how do we help heal? How do we help move forward in different ways? And so when a natural disaster occurs, there's a general consensus for most of us that it has actually occurred, right? We can see it happening. We witness it, we hear about it, we read about it, etc. And its traumatic implications are oftentimes understood. There's a general consensus that, when there's a major mass flooding or hurricane or tsunami or earthquake, whatever it is, most individuals are going to have some consensus about the impact that may have in those traumatic implications. Racism, sexism, classism, the isms of the world in many ways, unfortunately, there are still people who question the effects of those in people's lives and whether or not those things actually exist. There are still people who are pushing back on the notion that there's systems in place that benefit the few to the detriment of many more. And so those isms do not have a consensually agreed upon criteria, if you will. And so those socio-political experiences oftentimes that many less privileged and minoritized communities experience are sort of in the margins in some ways when we're talking about more traditional types of trauma. And so those traumatic realities are often questioned. Those isms are often questioned, despite that these stressors are central to the experiences of many of us and many of the communities that we work with. And so it behooves us to think about how we can begin to expand and be inclusive in our methodologies, interventions, theorizing and research, etc. Okay, Ileana, thank you. So ethno-racial trauma, just to briefly touch on that, has been defined by this individual and or collective psychological distress and fear of danger that results from experiencing or witnessing discrimination, threats of harm, violence, and intimidation directed at ethno-racial devalued groups. My colleagues these are good colleagues and friends of mine who do phenomenal work here, have said that this kind of trauma stems from a legacy of oppressive laws, policies, and practices, which are continuing to be present at this very moment in time. And so I think we have to understand that as we think about what constitutes trauma and how it's affecting people, particularly less privileged and minoritized communities. Okay, all right. I mentioned the intersection of our different social cultural identities. Intersectionality is one of those other words that somehow has become like, a bad word or not a good word to use. And essentially what we're saying is that, look, if you're a woman and a woman of color and maybe an immigrant and someone who doesn't speak English and maybe has very few resources, those different variables and identities that are a part of who you are going to manifest and show up and maybe in more ways than myself as a male who's Mexican American, lighter skinned in general, highly educated, socioeconomically privileged, etc. Let's be very clear. Racism does not affect all people of color, all BIPOC communities in the exact same way. and white-bodied privilege does not benefit all white-bodied individuals in the same way either. And so I think we have to be careful that we're not simplifying those ideas and terms in some ways, because I think that perpetuates even more divide and divisiveness. Even the term white privilege evokes emotions, I think, from people, and that's not necessarily a negative thing. I have privilege. What am I going to do with my privilege? If you're sitting here and listening today, you have privilege. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but what can I do with it to help others who might be less privileged than I am in some ways? And so I think this idea of intersections, it's exacerbated. Racial trauma is exacerbated when we talk about those issues in many ways. And then we talk about intergenerational trauma. Descendants who did not experience the trauma directly can still evidence signs and symptoms of distress related to the trauma. Those of you who have some form of traumatic experiences in your family, those messages have been either directly or indirectly a part of your family culture, your family values, and then they become part of our own experiences as well in some ways. Okay, Leanna, you can go to the next slide. And then just some of the effects. I think this is probably pretty clear for most of you. It affects, our physical health, our psychological health, our identity in many ways. For many BIPOC communities, oftentimes we sort of, when you look at health statistics and data, we are at higher risk for cardiovascular disease and strokes and low birth weights and other kinds of, and engaging maybe in practices that others may deem to be unhealthy. And so I think oftentimes the response is, well, just exercise more, or just eat more healthy, or just whatever. That's like having a one size fits all stress buster and say, hey, go do this, and it's not that simple. And yet we don't also have to make it that complicated either. We have to listen more, understand more, and then integrate some of those things in our work and what we're doing. But these are all different ways that I think those exposures to those isms can affect us in different ways. Okay, Leanna. I'm going to sort of transition a little bit to just thinking about kind of what I oftentimes talk about when I talk about what it means to heal. I'm going to lean a little bit more on sort of how BIPOC communities can begin to heal, and also talk about my colleagues and friends and family who might identify as white or white-bodied individuals. I love this Mexican proverb: they tried to bury us, they didn't know we were seeds. And I think, as much as we need to be thinking about our sort of ancestors and those that came before us, we also need to start thinking about those that are going to follow, and those that we need to sort of pave a way for that, so it looks differently. So you're going to hear me repeat this again, that while we may have inherited some of the traumas and some of the stress and some of the ways of negotiating the world of our ancestors and family members, parents, grandparents, or maybe, we also inherited many positive strengths, values, resiliency, resistance in many ways that I think we oftentimes can use as we move forward to do this work and to heal. Okay, Leanna. So here's one of those words that I think has become, I think a sort of politicized word, and I think a word that has and oftentimes become very divisive. And I want to try to not make it such, if I can. And really, it's really just a revisit and a deeper understanding of why many of us, or how many of us, have come to understand sort of our world and what it looks like and how it continues to operate at times. And so if we think about this idea of colonization, and again, I want to sort of sort of depathologize this word, if you will, but to justify the subjugation or the dehumanization of people, of communities, images and narratives need to be created so that that subjugation makes sense. Okay. Otherwise, you know, it becomes like shocking. It becomes absurd. And you saw me use the term white-bodied individuals earlier, a few minutes ago. I use that term from I got that term and an idea from Resmaa Menakem in the book My Grandmother's Hands, you know, Healing Racial Trauma. And he talks about how trauma is stored in our bodies. And so when Diana was doing the breathing technique and all that, you know, I love that, because I think that healing in the body oftentimes is where I think the healing needs to happen in our bodies. And why he sort of talks about this idea of white-bodied individuals, because he says that even as we're talking about the trauma that has affected so many BIPOC communities, our white-bodied family members, friends, those that we love and care about, and other community members have also endured and had to, over time, adjust and adapt to what once was traumatic and dehumanizing situations. So he says, imagine being a white individual when Black individuals are being lynched, and what one has to do to be able to continue to move forward and do life in some meaningful way, and to sort of kind of develop a perspective or idea or notion about you know, why this makes sense, or why this might be okay, or maybe not even why it makes sense or why it's not okay, but just how to kind of keep moving without being paralyzed or debilitated. And he says that's been passed on as well. That has continued to be passed on as well. So as we think about healing and what healing means, it's about also recognizing that all of us, whether we're BIPOC, white identified, etc., we have been inculcated with ideas and values of seeing the world in particular ways that have served us to a certain degree, and maybe not been so helpful to others at the same time. So I think, you know, we had to think, individuals who were interested in subjugating and dehumanizing Black African-American communities had to really identify ways to make sense of that, to sort of develop an image and narrative about these Black and African-American communities, so that those behaviors and those continued actions were not so absurdly shocking to so many people. And so the one of the images that I oftentimes use is this idea of the you know, historically the lazy Latino, you know, the not hardworking Latino individual. And this image is a good example of how this process of colonizing works and how it continues to justify actions. And so in some ways, this idea of the image of the lazy Latino, if you will, is a helpful myth, because in some ways it sort of lifts up those individuals who have more power and privilege, and it sort of humbles and minimizes those who are less privileged even further. And so the image or the narrative in that way becomes the justification or the excuse for the colonial situation, because without an image or a narrative like that, the actions of the colonist would appear to be shocking, as I mentioned. And so what it also implies is that the employment of someone of those less privileged communities is not very profitable. And so it justifies paying low wages to those less privileged communities. And so one interpretation of that is that colonization would profit by employing more experienced workers at the end of the day. Why is that important and why does that matter? Because the qualified worker ultimately comes from the privileged class, earning 3 or 4 times the amount of money that those less privileged communities ultimately earn. And so it's more profitable to use the labor of 3 or 4 of those less privileged community members and pay them less than to pay one of the more privileged community members at the end of the day. And so the privileged community member becomes the specialist, the expert, and the less privileged become the laborers ultimately. And so that becomes justification for those in privilege and those who have power oftentimes. And so what happens is that the less privileged become identified as being less active, more lazy, etc. And in contrast, the more privileged is always in action. And so in some ways, we as BIPOC communities have internalized this notion that the more we feel our humanity is being questioned, the more we want to prove ourselves to those systems that continue to question who we are and our value and our worth. And by constantly staying busy, by always being in action, by externally focusing on sort of trying to prove ourselves, our value and worth in many ways, we also are unconsciously perpetuating and to some degree colluding with those very systems that we're trying to re-envision and reimagine in many ways. And so I think when we think about healing for BIPOC communities, this is some of the work that we're doing and talking about, trying to help many BIPOC communities understand that being mindful and breathing and resting is so critical to healing, and that always being in action and needing to do and prove ourselves, when we know it sometimes no matter how much we do and how much we work, we still might not be seen in a different way, contributes to our sort of traumas, if you will, and some of the challenges that we experience along the way. Aaliyah, you can go to the next slide. So when I think about what it means to then sort of unlearn and relearn this idea of decolonizing, and I just want to say, in none of these terms and in none of my interest am I interested in sort of saying that if you're a white-bodied individual or if you come from the privileged, quote unquote, privileged class, that you're bad, that you're evil, that you should feel bad for who you are. None of that's helpful, and none of that's going to help us heal and reduce division and divisiveness. There's nothing in these comments that I want to convey that perpetuates that message, because that's unhelpful in these conversations and in our process of trying to heal. When I think about decolonization, I think about the Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon, French psychiatrist. And he says when he's talking about his own people, Algerians, that there's no way to return to pristine pre-colonial times. So the only way to change the stratification of post-colonial world is through unlearning and relearning, or decolonization, right? And he talks about that, you know, even in Fanon's work, people have questioned and critiqued him for sort of coming from perspectives that I don't think are always necessarily accurate or reflect the reality. But in Fanon's work, he even says that, look, it does not mean that we're trying to dehumanize other human beings in the process of trying to humanize ourselves. In fact, Dr. King said, if we do eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, none of us are going to be able to see or speak at the end of the day. So that is not what we're perpetuating or trying to purport here, and trying to think about how we can unlearn and relearn some of what our societal systems, how they operate and what they look like in many ways. And so most unlearning and relearning in many ways has sort of theories and ideas have focused primarily on the less privileged of those communities who have been on the receiving end of oppressive behaviors and systems. But that cannot just be, we cannot just focus on the less privileged and minoritized communities. This process of unlearning and relearning and healing must also include those individuals from the more privileged classes as well, that encouraging those individuals to sort of kind of understand and revisit and relearn in some ways and deconstruct their own culture and ideologies in process of trying to heal. And so the cultures of the colonized need to return stolen lands, which is happening in some ways, reparations. And and create relations that are not based on white body supremacy, which continues to exist today. It's not a bad word. And it doesn't mean that if you're white body that you should feel bad or guilty for who you are or where you come from. In fact, quite the contrary. I'd like for you to understand what that means and how you can better use, who you are in the context of where we are as a human body, if you will. And so Deloria says, when we leave behind the culture shock, those of us who have come from less privileged societies, communities, we will be the masters of our own fate. And again, and able to determine for ourselves what kind of lives we all lead. And I think that's what we're trying to help many BIPOC communities do in some ways at this moment in time. Okay, Leanna, I'm going to start wrapping up here. So liberation psychology and radical healing. Liberation psychology, really draws upon the need for communities to recover historical memory, which helps many less privileged and minoritized and oppressed communities revive and employ methods used by their ancestors to survive, resist, and organize. Not organized to dehumanize, but organized to liberate, organized to re-envision. One of the greatest, travesties in this process that I've just described of the more privileged, maybe at times subjugating the less privileged, is the loss of creativity and imagination to those communities who have been subjugated to oppressive behaviors. And so I think there's a process of how do we help communities reimagine, be creative. How can you be creative and reimagine the work that you're doing, and walk side by side? So liberation psychology really embodies that members of minoritized, subjugated groups, that we view are those experiences as collective, which then implies coming together collectively to respond and to do something differently moving forward, not divide and conquer, that we understand history, the socio-historical context. We are very ahistorical here in the United States. And I think many of us don't know our histories very well. And I think it serves us to do that very well, to do that and to learn that. The goal should not be to, promote, the goal should be designed to promote self-determination for many community members, and really target and understand the institutions and systems that, continue to create and maintain oppressive realities for many communities. And so healing entails an explicit focus on active resistance rather than solely reactionary resilience. We don't want people to adapt to unhealthy situations. We want people, all of us, to work together to change that in some ways. And so liberation psychology at its best really just says, if we can help communities understand that the challenges that many are experiencing are part of a larger sociocultural context, then it helps those community members realize that they're part of a larger network of systems in place that create unjust realities at times. And it takes the burden off of them from feeling like it's their problem and their fault. When we endorse that perspective, as I mentioned earlier, we're sustaining the status quo. It stays in place. It does not change. And so we need to remove the burden solely from placing on those less privileged communities and replace it and relocate it within our systems at times that we may be unintentionally oppressing others. Good, well-intentioned systems and people can unintentionally violate others at times without even knowing it. Okay, Leanna, a couple more slides. So, it's not just about coping, but helping people adjust and not acclimate to structural and systemic racist systems. You can go to the next slide. I already covered most of that. And then, a couple of my other some colleagues who I have a lot of respect for, they talked about defined radical healing for BIPOC communities, and they said it had 5 anchors. Collectivism, personal liberation is connected to the BIPOC collectives, understanding that we got coming together, working together. Critical consciousness, being active participants, self-reflecting, acting upon our environments to create meaningful change, strength and resistance, remembering we've inherited both strength and wisdoms as well, cultural authenticity and knowledge, resisting those images and narratives that have been sort of perpetuated throughout our history and in our world that tell us that we are certain ways and that we can only do certain things and we can only go so far in certain systems, etc. And honoring sort of racial, cultural pride in who we are, not to offend and dehumanize others, but to affirm ourselves and walk with others in this process. And then radical hope, believing that we can change things for the greater good at the end of the day. Let me wrap up, Ileana, just a couple more slides. You can skip that one. We've talked about that already in different ways. Just a couple of things. I think finding meaning and hope. I think we have to dismantle these systems. It starts with us, with each of you, with us. I think we have to resist the unconscious need to be the martyr. This is an internalization of those colonial systems, if you will. Mind, body. I think the spirit connection, personal self-care is important and necessary. Resting is resistance. Honor ourselves by showing up, letting our feelings show up, naming them, allowing them to become part of our experiences. And then, as community members, we are the community. How we treat ourselves is how we're going to treat others in the process. And then finally, what does it mean to be human? The last slide, Ileana. I just think I want to just end with our just really helping people reflect on our professional knowledge and expertise does not eliminate us from being influenced by things that matter to us, our lived experiences, social status, the privileges of our personal identities. We're not indifferent observers whose personal biases and a priori commitments, emotional involvement, and are absent in our professional functioning. John Carlson states that our new charge must be to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. There's a difference between allyship and catering to the audience. The former is focusing on what is right, while the latter is appearing to be right. We don't want to get caught up in the latter. And then Dr. Lewis wrote this about her profession, her medical profession, but I think it relates to our work as well within our community work, our social systems, mental health systems, etc., that our profession calls on us to do no harm, but it also sits in a place of inaction while societal abuse is being perpetuated. And so what is our role? Those images, those narratives are still being perpetuated today at this moment in time to justify the dehumanization and the actions of individuals and systems. And so how can we begin to understand where we are in this process as individuals, where our systems are, so that true healing can happen as we move forward. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and hopefully that's been helpful to just kind of think about and conceptualize some of this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. And we have time for a couple of questions. Rima, that's a long question.
I'll read it very, very quickly.
Okay.
How would you start decolonializing? For example, colonizing is not just of races and ethnicities, but of sexes. When 90% of victims of sex trafficking are women and girls, and 90% of those are American citizens, and 60% of those are Black and Brown and Indigenous, it's a multi-level colonization, which is part of the abusive, patriarchal, archaic system. So what solutions other than punishing demand? How would you start decolonizing and unwrapping that onion, so to speak?
Well, it's interesting. It's a great question, and I could probably spend an hour and a half talking about that as well. But it's a really good question. I think it's so interesting because one of the things I think we have to do is we have to kind of think about like why are we even tolerating these kinds of things in society to begin with as a first step? I mean, we tend to blame the quote unquote victims or victim survivors oftentimes in these situations. Unfortunately that happens sometimes, or where they've come from or their communities or whatever it is. And I think we're asking the wrong questions. Number one, I think we have to sort of ask, like, why are these even still tolerated in the first place? And then secondly, and maybe even more importantly, like, what is happening in our sort of systems that we're continuing to sort of support, whether it's consciously, unconsciously, the continuation of these attitudes, ideologies, behaviors in some way or another. So I have to think about how we're socializing young kids, young boys and young girls today, oftentimes. And I think about juxtaposing that simultaneously with this movement to just not talk about any of these things in our elementary and formative school systems. And I think it's a mistake not to do that, because I think we're missing opportunities to really try to develop and teach our kids different ways of existing and being oftentimes, and training our teachers and our parents to sort of think about what they might be doing, whether it's conscious or unconsciously, to support and perpetuate some of these attitudes and ideologies and behaviors that ultimately end up sometimes in these kinds of just dehumanizing acts and behaviors, whether it's because men, we feel that we have rights over women and bodies. I mean, look, you know, we had laws that were just passed, and this is very controversial for some. It's not controversial for me. I don't think we should be passing laws that determine what women can and cannot do with their bodies. And I am a fervent Catholic churchgoer, and I am pro-life and pro-choice. I don't want any senseless death and dehumanization to happen. Yet at the same time, I don't think we have a right to be telling women what they can and cannot do with their bodies. So even that kind of discussion and those kind of policies, they're sending messages to women, to men, to young boys and girls. And so anybody decolonizing it, how can we understand those processes and how they're impacting people, and the messages they're sending, whether it's sort of overt, covert, conscious, unconscious, because people are listening, kids are listening, adolescents are listening. And so I think it's about unlearning. How do we teach our kids to understand when these things happen, and really begin to sort of kind of go back a little bit and think about where it started and how we got here and why. And I think even if we look at our history, so understanding history is so important. So I think just even thinking about that process of just understanding where our policies and practices come from, who benefits from them, who doesn't, who are laws really made for and who are they not. You know, we see that happening now. When you know, even we think about our history of, you know, substance use and drug use in this country, and you know, look how long it took to get the VAWA Act in the country. You know, that was not that long ago. Why on earth did it take us that long to protect the rights, primarily women, and during, you know, historically speaking, and still today, primarily women? Why has it taken so long? Well, it's because we're still valuing some lives more than others, and women are not as valued across different determinants of health and safety and in our society as we as men are. And we need to, where did that come from? How does that exist, and why does it continue to exist? And how can we begin to do that differently? I mean, those are questions that we have to really, I think, dialogue about. And I think we're doing the exact opposite. We're trying to sort of stop all those things from happening. I'm not a supporter of cancel culture at all. I don't support that. I don't value that. Look, if I'm going to talk today for the last half hour, 4 minutes, I know I've said things that some people are not agreeing with and have not, and have had a hard time hearing. And so I want to listen to you as well, because I know you probably have things that I may not necessarily fully agree with or be comfortable with. We just have to be okay with that. We have to be okay in being conversation. And if we're not, you know, breaking these things down and trying to understand the historical nature of these things and who benefits and who doesn't, then I think we're going to continue to face some of these challenges. So that was a long-winded response. I'm not even sure I answered your question, but you know, I could talk about that for a while. So yeah. And Ileana's telling me we got to move on. So
Yeah, if you could answer the questions in the chat, that would be great. But I do want to transition over to resources. We have one more presenter as well, and I want to give them a little bit of time. This session is recorded and will be available. I welcome everyone to join us at the next Equity and Healing session that we will have. And we're excited to be highlighting Ruth Dees, who is from Kaiser Permanente. And she'll be talking about cultivating a practice of mindfulness. We've had the pleasure of connecting with her, and she is amazing. We're really looking at highlighting the work of our partners. And so please join us for that. And that'll be September 30th, again, from 11 to 12:30. And we have other speakers that we are lining up. If you are new to us, Miguel and I have done a series of lots of webinars that are also recorded. If you're interested in those, just reach out to us. We've done one on equity, diversity, and inclusion, culturally responsive trauma-informed practices. We've talked about anti-racism and intersectionality, health equity and social determinants of health, implicit bias and cultural humility, and also have provided some support around developing equity implementation practices. As part of our network of care, we are launching, we've done a couple of pilots, but we're doing our network launch scheduled for September 30th. Our community chose a platform called Find Help, and we will be having Dr. Weiss from CHOC and Dr. Karen Lincoln, who is our chief strategist at MindOC, presenting at the very first meeting for the 101 training. And also we will have Find Help 201 on October 7th, and we'll have technical assistance provided bi-monthly as well. So there's a flyer that's going to be going out for that shortly. And we are working to align this work within Be Well. Let me put the link for the Be Well Network launch in the chat so you can register for that. And this is really about connecting people to resources in the community and really integrating healthcare and community organizations and community together. The Be Well Together conference, the second annual one, will be taking place on October 14th. The theme is community hope and healing. And the Friday, October 14th will be on Zoom, but on Saturday, October 22nd, we'll have community healing events taking place at different diverse organizations throughout Orange County, and we're really excited about that. And it's another way for us to incorporate a lot of this healing work out in communities. And we have some of our partners here that are going to be hosting some of those. And we are also really excited to be partnering with the HEC Trauma Institute to launch a lot of healing activities. And I'm going to turn it over to Jess. I believe it's Jess, who will be talking more about the work that HEC Trauma Institute is doing.
Thank you so much, Ileana. My name is Jessica Boat, and I'm the Director of Education at the HEC Trauma Institute. Thank you, Ileana, and the Be Well team for inviting us today. Just to give you a little bit of a summary of who we are a nonprofit, and we provide education, information, and services to help empower and support those affected by trauma. And unfortunately, as everyone here on this call can probably attest to, that's everyone, whether it's a direct impact of trauma or an indirect impact of trauma. So our audience does span to so many different communities. Next slide. So what is MBSR? MBSR is a complementary health approach to healing the whole person by enhancing the mind-body connection. The goal of the program is to mitigate adverse impacts of toxic stress and trauma, to support personal enlightenment, and to provide tools and strategies for strengthening mental health and wellness. Next slide. So as part of HTI's MBSR program that we are so excited to launch in collaboration with BWO and other community partners, we're creating accessible education, toolkits, activities to address each of the stress busters. So the content is available in multiple languages and accessible in several formats. Additionally, events will be offered both on demand and live virtual settings. The education will include on-demand trauma-informed yoga, meditation exercises, and additionally, we're hosting ACEs educational content for the community and also for mental health providers, and those will be APA approved for continuing education units. So make sure to check it out if you need CEs. Next slide. So 2 events that we are hosting on a reoccurring basis is virtual Reiki. It's going to be offered through Sage Holistic Wellness Center. If you're not familiar with Reiki, some of the benefits include reducing pain and inflammation, increasing the effectiveness of traditional medicine and psychiatric treatment. The practice provides stress reduction and relaxation. And it also is known to improve sleep, optimism, digestive function, hope, memory, and spiritual growth. Our trauma-informed yoga life skills is going to be hosted by Uprising Yoga. It is a mindfulness meditation with a mindset coaching and education structure. So it's not going to be that typical yoga that one may think of initially. It's going to be a very relaxing and enjoyable opportunity. Reiki will be offered monthly, and again, that's going to be live virtual. And then the trauma-informed yoga, the yoga life skills, will be offered every Wednesday at 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So we are really excited. We hope that everyone here goes and registers, and we hope to see you then. Please share this information with your community, whether that's your colleagues or community, your clients. Anyone and everyone is welcome to join. These events are accessible to all and free of charge. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me at jfote@traumainst.org or info@traumainst.org. We'll make sure to get my information in the chat as well. Thank you, Dr. Hamill. Thank you, Ileana.
Yes, thank you. We're really excited to be partnering with HEC Trauma Institute, and I'm going to pass it over to Andrea in case you have some last thoughts, Andrea, and how people can join our network.
Hi, I know that this was such an amazing conversation. Thank you, Dr. Gallardo. Thank you, Jess, for sharing what HTI is going to be providing for supporting our community and our collective impact movement here. If you are new to our equity and inclusion work group and would like to participate in other ACEs activities, learn more about what's going on throughout the community in our steering committee meetings, please do email me, andrea.mander@mind-oc.org, and we'll get you looped into all of the series of events that we have going on. Thank you everybody so much for joining us today, and thank you especially to our presenters and Diana Daly for taking us through that lovely Mamas activity, and Ileana, as always, for pulling together these incredible conversations that we're able to have.
Thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you are able to join us on September 30th. We have lots of great presentations coming up that we are organizing, and you'll be really pleasantly surprised. Please let others know about this. This is an opportunity for us to continue to expand our network, and a lot of the sessions have been recorded, so we'll find a way to also put them out in the social media world, so people can access them as well. So if you want to register for the HTI classes, which I'm really excited about that are starting, you can go directly to the HTI website and they have registration there. So more to come, lots of additional healing stuff to happen. Thank you, Miguel, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.